Today we have Professor Keith Sinclair talking about ethnic and sectarian tensions within Israel. Professor Sinclair is a political science professor here at Grand Rapids Community College, and will be talking to us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry for the late start. We had technical difficulties with the computer. But thank you for coming to hear about the ethnic divisions within Israel, which is my topic today. And although I do not intend to go over the whole history of the founding of Israel, inevitably I think I should touch on a little bit. For example, we know that Israel was founded in 1948 after a long period of migration from Europe, of European Jews seeking a state for themselves. During that time that Israel was founded, it was governed by Britain as a province of Palestine in what had previously been the Ottoman Turkish Empire prior to World War I. Jews had migrated from Europe all through that time, and in 1948, fighting broke out between these European Jews and the Arab-speaking peoples in which they lived with, and the Jews won that Arab-Israeli war and declaring Israel an independent state and having it recognized in 1948. The United Nations had tried to preempt fighting and war by actually recommending a partition of what had been called Palestine up until that time, which would have roughly divided the land 50-50, even though Jews were only about a third of the population of this region. Obviously, the Arabs didn't think that fair, and the fighting resulted anyway. And with the Israeli victory, the state of Israel was created, along with what became known as many Palestinian refugees, Arab-speaking people who left and fled the fighting. And we'll return to that in a few moments. This became what is known as the State of Israel, previously known as Palestine under British rule. The Israelis, Jews, did not take all of the territory. The orange portion here was basically what the United Nations was willing to concede to the Jews, dividing the land roughly 50-50. As you can see, through war and fighting, the Jews did much better than that. They ended up taking the green areas as well. The only areas they didn't take was the yellow, what is known as the Gaza Strip today, and the West Bank, and up here, the Golan Heights, which was a part of Syria. So those all remained Arab-controlled, and the colored portions, the green and the orange, became, in 1948, the State of Israel. Now, there were those Arabs who fled the fighting. Many of them went to the yellow areas. Some of them went even farther afield and have become known as the Palestinian diaspora. Many of them hoped and dreamed of returning to their homes, but those who fled the land were not allowed back by the State of Israel. Those Arabs who remained within the green and orange areas were allowed to stay in the new State of Israel, even though they were Arabs, and they were allowed to become citizens of Israel. And they have actually done fairly well for themselves in the State of Israel. They certainly have their grievances, but for the most part, peace has been maintained between that minority population and the greater Jewish population of the State of Israel today. Most of the real problems lie with the Palestinian refugees who fled to the yellow areas or beyond. Now let's fast forward up to 1967, which is a very important year. Like I said, I don't want to go through a lot of history, but some of it is inevitable. In 1967, we have a new Arab-Israeli war between Israel and its Arab neighbors, who really had all remained hostile to Israel since its founding. There was no really peace agreement. The fighting just stopped. In 1967, there was another war. Again, Israel would win this war. Israel would actually do a surprise attack on the Arabs because what they saw as Arab provocation. The most important Arab country being Egypt, and Egypt led by Gamal Nasser, who was basically a general or a dictator at the time. He did several things that were seen to be very provocative by the State of Israel. And he did so primarily because he was perceived as weak by many other Arab states. For example, since the previous war, there were UN peacekeepers in what is now known as the Sinai Peninsula. Many other Arab state leaders considered Gamal Nasser was hiding behind these UN peacekeepers, so he ordered the UN peacekeepers out. He also then remilitarized the Sinai Peninsula. By the way, the UN peacekeepers asked to go on the Israeli side of the border, and Israel wouldn't allow them there either, so they were forced to leave. Egypt then brought in its military, remilitarizing the Sinai, and they also blockaded the port of Eilat, the Israeli Jewish port here on the Gulf of Aqaba, all seen as very provocative from the Israelis' point of view. Israel, as a state, perceived this as a hostile maneuver, possibly preceding an attack. So Israel decided to attack first, which they did remarkably successfully, catching the Arab Air Force on the ground, and in fact winning the 1967 war within a span of the first day. Once the Arab Air Force was destroyed, the rest of it was just a cakewalk. Although Syria and Jordan and Iraq came to the aid of Egypt, all of them being Arab-speaking countries, they were all subsequently defeated in what became known as the Six-Day War. So Israel, in the Six-Day War, took the Sinai Peninsula, took the Gaza Strip, and took the West Bank and the Golan Heights from Syria, in effect capturing all of the territory that was a part of Palestine prior to 1948 and the founding of Israel. And of course, gaining in the process a whole new Arab population or Palestinian population that would not eventually be admitted as citizens of Israel, but would remain non-citizens of Israel, thus the political problem. What's also interesting is that Israel also attacked the United States Navy in this very same war. They attacked the USS Liberty, which was off the coast of the Sinai. The USS Liberty was a US Navy ship that was basically observing communications between the opposing forces. There's a lot of speculation as to why it was attacked. Of course, the Israeli government said that it was a mistake, that they didn't mean to kill the 34 US sailors on that ship. But the US Navy and those aboard the ship said that there wasn't a cloud in the sky, there was no mistaking that it was a US ship, that the only attack could have been intentional. So if it was intentional, why would the Israelis have attacked a US Navy ship? It is believed that they wanted to hide their pivot. They were in the process of having defeated the Egyptians and the Jordanians. They were ready to pivot and actually do a surprise attack on the Golan Heights, a very strategic area that was a part of Syria. And of course, it was a success. I suppose they didn't know, the US being neutral, what the US might have done. Anyway, it's all speculation. But we know the attack occurred. The Israeli government said it was a mistake. Lyndon Johnson, who was president of the United States at the time, wasn't willing to press the issue and was willing to accept the explanation. Of course, he had other things on his mind, such as the Cold War and the Vietnam War, which was occurring simultaneously. So this surprise attack on the part of the Israelis, phenomenally successful beyond even the Israelis' dreams, capturing more land than they ever anticipated belonging to them. And of course, much of it was sought after by the Israelis because you reunified Jerusalem. The border prior to that actually, as you see here, went all the way around what is known as the West Bank. And the West Bank, by the way, refers to the west bank of the Jordan River. This is the Jordan River. This is the east bank of the Jordan River. This is the west bank of the Jordan River. So that's where that gets its name. The Gaza Strip down here is just a strip of land with the major city being the city of Gaza, which is why it gets its name, the Gaza Strip. Prior to 1967, the Egyptians had controlled the Gaza Strip, dating back to the 1948 war. Prior to 1967, the Jordanians had occupied the West Bank. With their defeat in 1967, it is now Israeli territory, so say the Israelis. What's interesting enough is that the United States does not recognize any of that land captured in 1967 as Israeli land. The United States government recognizes Israel's proper border being the green and the orange that we talked about, dating back to 1948. The United States does not recognize the Gaza Strip as Israeli territory, nor does the United States recognize the West Bank or the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. This is difficult for many Israelis to accept because that portion of the West Bank comprising Jerusalem is most prized by them. And they, of course, consider Jerusalem their undisputed capital, not subject to negotiation. The United States does not see it that way. Prior to the 1967 war, the border went right through the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a divided city. The Israelis only had West Jerusalem, dating back to 1948. East Jerusalem was Arab, and at that time controlled by Jordan. And of course, that was the most important part of the city, because that held the ancient city, the Temple Mount, that the Jews was so important to them. So today, Israel considers Jerusalem its undivided capital, but the United States does not recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We recognize Tel Aviv, which is why our embassy remains in Tel Aviv. We do have two consulates, to be fair, to both sides, one in West Jerusalem, one in East Jerusalem, that remain today. But it is this kind of this game that we play diplomatically, according to U.S. foreign policy. This is the Jordan River. This is now the boundary, from many Israelis' point of view, from between Israel and Jordan. As you can see, as said, there's more water in it, or there's more history in it than water, actually, because so much of it has been siphoned off to be used for irrigation in much of Israel. The UN Security Council resolution passed the same year that this war occurred basically orders that there be a negotiated peace between the Israelis and the Arabs, that the negotiated settlement be roughly along the 1967 borders, and that this land is not automatically considered a part of Israel. Now, the Israelis have continued to build settlements in the West Bank ever since, and these settlements are a direct violation of this UN Security Council resolution. A resolution, by the way, that the United States would have had to support at the time, because if we had vetoed it, it wouldn't have happened, because we are on the Security Council permanently. Well, with that said, we can get into really the ethnic divisions within Israel today. Now, I said that many Jews that came from Europe, and they approximately now are, well, they were dominant through much of the 20th century, but also we had another migration from many of the Arab countries after Israel was founded. Most of these Jews are sometimes called Sephardic Jews. Most of the Northern European Jews referred to as Ashkenazi Jews. The Ashkenazi Jews have a history of speaking Yiddish, which is basically a combination of Hebrew and Middle German, Middle-aged German. The Sephardic Jews, many of them coming from Spain, they were kicked out of Spain back in 1492 with Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen. When they kicked out the Moors, the Muslims, they also kicked out all the Jews. And the Jews who lived there at the time would have spoke, many of them, Ladino, which is basically a cross between Hebrew and Middle-aged Spanish. Many of these Jews went to North Africa, many parts of what the Ottoman Turkish Empire was, Greece, Turkey, and they're known as Sephardic Jews. And so you had this division within Jewish politics, within the state of Israel today, between the Sephardics and the Ashkenazi Jews. It's not quite the division that it used to be. The Ashkenazi Jews were very politically important in the founding of Israel, and the Sephardic Jews kind of resented the fact that the Ashkenazi Jews had a lot of the political power for most of Israeli history. Well, with further migrations, that has changed, where the Sephardic Jews now outnumber the Ashkenazi Jews, and they are finding their political footing and asserting themselves politically in ways that they hadn't before. So that's one interesting division within Israel. You also have some others. I think this chart is actually rather telling. This shows you of the population of Israel proper, meaning within the boundaries of what the United States recognizes as Israel. But it also includes some of the settlements that the Jews have in the West Bank. It does not include those non-Jewish citizens, or residents, I should say, in the West Bank, basically Palestinians, the people without a country, Palestinian refugees, Palestinians on occupied territory, whatever you want to refer to them. If you just look at those who have Israeli citizenship, another way of showing you what this chart looks at. You can see that obviously the vast majority of Israeli citizens are in fact Jewish, but it's really only 80% of the population. You have a good 20% of the population that is not Jewish at all. In fact, the vast majority of them are, well, they refer to themselves as Palestinian, identifying with that Arab identity. The Israelis don't like to use the word Palestinian, so Israelis refer to them as Arab Israelis. Right? These are Arabs who happen to have Israeli citizenship. Why? Because their families stayed behind what became the front lines after the 1948 war. They were ones who remained in what became the State of Israel. They were the ones who were granted citizenship. Their family members who fled were never allowed back to Israel and never gained citizenship. So these would be the Arab Israelis who eventually became citizens of Israel. And like I said, there are almost 1 in 5 Israelis today, not Jewish, despite the fact that Israel continues to insist on calling itself a Jewish state, which kind of give you the impression that like 90-some% were Jewish, and that's not the case. All right, so the Arab Israelis represented here, and that population continues to grow. Then you have some non-Jews living in Jewish households. Many of these individuals came with the fall of the Soviet Union, and many of them are Russians. And a large proportion of the population in Israel speaks Russian, much to the chagrin of the larger population of Jews. Many Israeli Jews, of course, today speak Hebrew. That became the official language of the State of Israel when it was founded. After all, it kind of makes logical sense. You had all these Jews migrating from all over Europe, many of them speaking Polish, Russian, German, French, Yiddish, whatever. They didn't necessarily speak each other's language. The one language they all had in common was the religious language of Hebrew. And so they adopted that as their common tongue, and basically resurrecting what had become a dead language, much like Latin is today. You really only, Catholic priests might know Latin because it's spoken in religious ceremony, but outside of that, Latin is pretty much a dead language. So Hebrew was that up until the 20th century and has since been resurrected in that sense with the founding of the State of Israel. So much to their embarrassment, many of these, so many Russians have come in recent years with the collapse of the Soviet Union that they haven't needed to learn Hebrew. They can live in their neighborhoods and speak Russian. And that is received with some annoyance by the larger population of Israel, who would like to see them assimilate and use Hebrew. Well, many of these Russians are not necessarily Jews. Many of these people, if you came to Israel and you had Jewish ancestry in that your mother was a Jew, or your grandmother was a Jew, you're recognized by the State of Israel as a Jew, whether you practice the religion or not. And of course, many of them were able to bring their spouses. So because of that right of return for Jews to the State of Israel, who are given automatically Israeli citizenship, many former members of the Soviet Union have left, taking advantage of that opportunity, having a grandmother who was a Jew, perhaps, even though they never really identified as being a Jew. And so you've got some people of Jewish descent who don't really necessarily consider themselves Jewish coming to the State of Israel, and that would be represented here by this line. You also have amongst Jews, you have more secular Jews, the vast majority of the population, and then some religious Zionists who, by the terms of this chart, would be recognized as the people who really want to, well, Zionist means somebody who wants to have Jerusalem as its capital, right? Because Mount Zion is in one of the 7 hills, I believe, of Jerusalem. And so a Zionist, dating back to the 19th century, was always somebody who wanted to create a Jewish state with Jerusalem as its capital. And these are also religious Zionists. They're not just nationalists. They're also devout Jews. And many of them have sought settlements in the West Bank. And then, of course, you have the ultra-Orthodox, sometimes called the Haradim. These are very, well, as the name implies, ultra-Orthodox Jews, very strict Jews, many of them following a style of dress, a way of life dating back to the 18th century, many of them dressing in blacks and the hats. And I'll show you some of the pictures of them later on. So they're an interesting category as well. But I think the most important thing that this chart shows you is just how many citizens of Israel are not Jewish. Like I said, at least 1 in 5 are Arab speaking. Arabic is their first language, not Hebrew. And most of them are Muslim. Some of them were Christian. About 12% of them would be Christian Palestinians. These are what I would refer to as secular Jews. This is my representation of secular Jews. What do I mean by a secular Jew? I mean somebody who identifies as being Jewish, but doesn't necessarily practice and live and breathe the faith every single day. In the same way, I might refer to secular Christians in the United States who may not go to church every Sunday. In fact, they may not go to church at all, except maybe on Christmas or Easter. Right? So that's what I'm talking about. And then, of course, there are some Jews who don't really even believe in God at all, but for them it's not a religion, it's more of an ethnicity. You know, and that's an ongoing question that was really existential for many Jews, even going back to the 19th century. What is a Jew? Is it an ethnicity or is it a religion? For many people, it's both, or it's one or the other. Depending on the Jew that you happen to ask, you'll get a different answer. So most of the population of Israel is very secular, I would say, and that dates back to its founding. This happened to be my guide in Israel when I was there. I just got back from Israel back January 7th, as a matter of fact. And I have some of my more recent pictures to show you. All right, the Orthodox Jews. All right, so the secular Jews who don't necessarily practice the faith, or at least not as much as the Orthodox. The Orthodox would keep true to the ancient laws, basically keeping their heads covered, wearing a kippah, or what is sometimes called a yarmulke, if you want to prefer the Yiddish word. They would pray 3 times a day. They would worship in synagogue in segregated fashion between men and women, women's worshiping separate from men. And you could even see that at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem to this day. And they obey kosher dietary laws. These would be what Christians would refer to as the Old Testament restrictions on what Jews could eat. For example, Jews will not eat pork. That's not kosher. And of course, how you prepare meat, how it's served, is all very restricted. And I found that frustrating for myself, just from a personal standpoint, going to some of the restaurants in Israel. You know, I remember my last night. I thought I was going to have this great meal. I was really hungry, and I thought, man, I'm really in the mood for a nice big steak or something. And it was a very kosher restaurant. And if you go to a kosher restaurant, on certain nights they have meat night, and then they have dairy night, because you can't have dairy not only on the same plate as your meat, you can't even have it in the same kitchen. So what we had was like salads with cheese, and that wasn't exactly what I was looking forward to filling me up that day. But it wasn't, we went to a kosher restaurant on dairy night. Now, we did see some kosher McDonald's as well, which was kind of interesting, where you wouldn't get a McFlurry at a kosher McDonald's, I'll tell you that. So no mixing of dairy with meat. And then, of course, they don't light sparks on the Sabbath. That's important. So they don't do work on the Sabbath, and they don't light sparks or lights. That can be variously interpreted. Here's my picture of a more Orthodox Jew. He's preparing to pray at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, wearing a temporary kippah that they hand out. This box here has in it the small scroll of the Torah. This is the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall. It is believed to be it's not really the wall of the temple. A lot of people make that mistake. It's really the retaining wall of the Temple Mount itself. This would have been the mount, and it's retained by this giant wall. The temple would have actually existed up on top. But the ancient temple that was destroyed by the Romans, according to many Israelis, should be rebuilt. Unfortunately for them, the Muslims have built a very important Dome of the Rock shrine on it, and you obviously can't have both. So that is going to be a real threat to many Muslims if they are indeed intent on rebuilding that temple. So here you see the segregated worship. This area of the wall of this line is for women to worship at the Wailing Wall, and this area for men. Many of them will pray, and then they will stick little prayers in the cracks of the Wailing Wall. It is behind this wall, of course, beneath what was the temple, where they believe that the divine presence of God is strongest. And where God lived, literally, for many centuries up until the destruction by the Romans. This is a kosher elevator in the hotel that we were staying at. And as I said, they don't light sparks on the Sabbath, those who faithfully follow the Orthodox tradition. And so this day happened to be the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath, this light here is denoting the fact that this elevator is the kosher elevator. This one is not. And so if you were unfortunate enough, like me, to walk into this elevator on the left, then you would have had to stop on every single floor of the hotel, because Orthodox Jews are not allowed to press the button that would actually light a spark or light up the button in the elevator. So you find this at various hotels. Obviously, a secular Jew would just maybe go into the one on the right. Then there's the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. I already mentioned those with my chart. I want to refer to them now. Many of them would follow the Orthodox tradition, but taking it a step further. Many of them dress in a more primitive way, akin to the 18th century, in much the same way I think that we would notice many Amish people dressing in a more traditional lifestyle, a simpler time, with simpler values, according to God's way. Many of them dress in black. Many of them are critical of the state of Israel. Many of them have downright contempt for the state of Israel, actually. What's interesting is that before Israel was founded, many of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox were adamantly opposed to the founding of the state of Israel. They had migrated from Europe like the other Jews. They had come to live in the land of the ancient temple of Jerusalem, as their ancestors did, and they were all for that. But they didn't necessarily want a state of Israel to be created, because that was considered to be a heresy. A modern state of Israel was supposed to be founded with the return of a chosen one by God, a Messiah, a successor to King David. It's not supposed to come about by the works of man. God was supposed to restore the state of Israel. So many saw it actually blasphemous for a state of Israel to be created. And they equally saw it blasphemous for people to speak Hebrew, a sacred language, only to be spoken in religious ceremonies. To speak it in a secular way, as everyday language, was considered by many ultra-Orthodox Jews and Orthodox as blasphemy, heresy. And yet that is exactly what happened. And it happened, why? Because the founders of the state of Israel were primarily secular Jews, not religious Jews. Now, and in fact, some of the ultra-Orthodox leaders who opposed the state of Israel, some of them were assassinated by more secular Jews prior to the founding. Many of them ended up coming on board once fighting broke out between the Jews and the Arabs, because not being Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, they didn't necessarily arm themselves, and so they were easy victims to Arabs when the war started. So with the victory of the Israeli Jews and the founding of the state of Israel, many of the Orthodox ended up accommodating themselves to the idea, just for their own personal survival, to the state of Israel. But they've never really been fond of the idea, and even though they've come around to it now for their own personal safety, many of them still don't have as much respect for man's law, attempting to overcome God's law. You know, so laws that the state of Israel might pass that they don't necessarily see as in God's way, they don't necessarily have respect for. And there is still one group of ultra-Orthodox Jews called Naturai Karta that is still trying to turn back the clock and do away with the state of Israel. In fact, they've found common cause with many of the Arabs, as a matter of fact. They've made appeals on behalf of the Palestinians. They think that the Palestinians haven't been treated well. And like I said, they're opposed to the whole idea of the state of Israel. They don't take government jobs. They don't vote. They're a very small group, however, within the ultra-Orthodox. But there is that still small group who's still opposed to the state of Israel. If you want to look them up online, that's Naturai Karta is the name. Many of these ultra-Orthodox Jews get deferment from the military. This many secular Jews resent. Right? Many secular Jews think that these individuals are not pulling their own weight. They're not forced to serve as all Israeli men are supposed to serve in the Israeli military. And they're not required to serve primarily because they're busy studying in yeshiva, studying ancient scripture. And the government gives them a paycheck to do that, which is even more resented by secular Jews in Israel. Some of these ultra-Orthodox are actually Hasidic Jews, and who are kind of the mystics of Judaism. Many of them will go into ecstatic dancing and chanting. Mystics, in whether we're talking Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there's mystics in all these faiths. And mystics attempt to experience God in a physical way. In the Christian tradition, we have Pentecostals, for example, who might speak in tongues, feeling the Holy Spirit. And they go into an ecstatic trance as well when that happens, speaking in languages that are long lost that nobody understands. But they believe they do it with the presence of God, the Holy Spirit. In similar ways, many of these Jews, when they worship, who are Hasidic and follow a mystical way, some of them will literally do somersaults or real ecstatic dancing in a euphoric way, experiencing God in a very physical kind of way. In Islam, they have the Sufi Muslims who essentially do the same thing. If you've ever seen the whirling dervishes that Turkey is known for, they'll put themselves into a static trance in a state of prayer, and they'll just turn for 40 minutes at a time. I've seen them do it for 40 minutes at a time. And what's amazing to me is they just walk away like it was nothing. I mean, if I just turned for 2 minutes, I'd be dizzy. I wouldn't be able to walk across the floor. But they're able to do it. Here's some of the ultra-Orthodox. I said literally they dress in black. And in fact, some of these secular Jews are very uncomfortable with many of these ultra-Orthodox Jews in their neighborhoods. They talk about the neighborhood turning black, and what they mean is you have the ultra-Orthodox moving in with their black coats and their very traditional ways. And they've really kind of dominated in the city of Jerusalem, the holy city. And many secular Jews don't feel as comfortable in Jerusalem. Many of them have chosen to live in the much more secular city of Tel Aviv because of that. Tel Aviv is a reputation as a party town, and Jerusalem, much more devout. Here's some more ultra-Orthodox Jews. And you can see the different styles of hats denoting the parts of Europe where they actually come from. The furrier, the colder climates. It's somewhat said, there's a rule of thumb that the larger the hat, the more traditional they are. You also see some of the Hasidic Jew curls, although not necessarily all Hasidic Jews would, not all the Jews wearing the curls would be Hasidic. Here you have someone who's demonstrating, or actually giving a lecture on the Kabbalah. I actually got to talk to him this last January when I was there. He's showing at the moment the tzitzit, which are these strings of knots that are tied onto the garments that he wears underneath his clothes. These are to remind him of the commandments of God, and many traditional Jews wear them. But he's also talking about the Kabbalah, which is a mystical form of Judaism that believes that there was esoteric knowledge passed down from Adam to Moses, and that much of it is based on numerology, where many of the ancient Hebrew language, the words, the letters represent not only letters but numbers, and so they perceive that there's hidden meanings in the Torah if you read the ancient scrolls in this way. Madonna is very into Kabbalah, even though she's not Jewish, so she's kind of showing a trend to embrace that mysticism. Here's a Jew wearing his tallit. He's got the knots on the four corners of the garment. This is actually a Samaritan. I had the opportunity to meet him, and I don't know what you've heard about Samaritans, but having met them, I can tell you they're good. They're really good people. And if they're the kind of people that would help you on the side of the road if you needed it. And they really are. They're Samaritans, and they date back to the period of what was the kingdom of Israel, when the Assyrians conquered them. And you've heard about the 10 lost tribes, for example, of Israel. Well, the Samaritans consider themselves one of those tribes. They're very small in number today. There's only about 700 of them left. And so they live in basically two communities. Some of them live in the West Bank with the Arabs and speak Arabic. And others live in Holon outside of Tel Aviv and speak Hebrew. Like I said, they trace themselves back kind of to the conquest of the Assyrians. They do not consider them, they don't call themselves Jews, because the Jew is a word that refers to Judah. The kingdom of Judah was the southern kingdom that was eventually conquered by the Babylonians. But the 10 tribes of the north, they were not Judah, so they wouldn't use the term Jew to describe themselves. The Israeli government today does consider them Jews and offers all of them citizenship of Israel, even the ones who are living in the West Bank amongst the Palestinians. They do practice a different version of the faith. They do not accept any of the prophets of Judaism after Moses. They only follow the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible, the Torah. They don't accept any prophets after Moses. They also read and use the ancient script in their service, the ancient Hebrew, which is actually a Phoenician alphabet. Modern Hebrew uses the Aramaic alphabet. Aramaic being a language that Christ is believed to have spoken. In their service, they will dress completely in white to denote their equality in the service. Their synagogues are different. There's no seating. They pray on the floor, more akin to what many Muslims would do in a mosque. And they do allow intermarriage, but the children are always raised as Samaritans. If the father's a Samaritan, the children will be raised as Samaritans. Other than that, I mean, he didn't wear this all the time. This would be something worn on the Sabbath. I mean, when I talked to him, he was just demonstrating this. I mean, he wouldn't look any different than you or I as far as very Western dress. So I'm not sure that you would necessarily know one was a Samaritan by looking at them. This is the ancient script in the books using the Phoenician alphabet as opposed to the modern Hebrew using the Aramaic. And they still go to Mount Gerizim, which is near Nablus in the West Bank. That is considered they do pilgrimages there on all their holy festivals. And they still sacrifice the lambs there like the priests would have done in the ancient temple. And tourists actually have an opportunity to see that if you're there during that festival. This is another minority ethnic group in the state of Israel. These are the Druze. The Druze are there's about 150,000 of them, 200,000 of them in Israel. Most of them live in the Galilee near Mount Carmel or in the Golan Heights. And those that live in the Galilee would have been made citizens of Israel with the founding of the state of Israel. And they do speak Arabic. Right? So they consider themselves, they're Arab Israelis, but they don't really consider themselves Palestinian. They consider themselves a people apart. Palestinians aspire for a state of their own. The Druze do not. The Druze never have aspired for a state of their own, and they are loyal to the state that they belong to. So as Arab Israelis, they are rather unique in the state of Israel in that they are required to serve in the Israeli military on their own, according to the own agreement when they were made Israeli citizens, and they are loyal to the state of Israel. In many ways, maybe more so, because they've had disproportion of members of their group killed in Israeli military and police tactics. It's thought that the Druze are admired fighters because they do not fear death. They believe in reincarnation. Their particular religion, which is what primarily denotes them, broke away from Islam back in the 11th century. So, but they respect many of the prophets of Islam, Judaism, Christianity, but they recognize the Fatimid Caliph of Egypt al-Hakim was his name, as an incarnation of God. And that was really when their sect broke away from the rest of Islam. But their most important pilgrimage site is just to the north of Tiberias, where they go to the tomb of Jethro. Jethro was a prophet of Israel as well. He was Moses' father-in-law. And so for some reason, the Jews considered him preeminent amongst prophets, and they all pilgrimaged there. So that's interesting. They are a very insular group. They do not believe in intermarriage, and they don't believe in conversion. They don't accept converting away from the Druze faith, and they don't accept any new converts into the Druze faith. You're born a Druze or you're not a Druze at all. And those who are born Druze are expected to marry Druze. And for members of their family to marry outside the faith, their family would cut them off. It would be a humiliation and a shame for their family, and they would be cut off from all family relationships if they did that. So they're a rather small population and likely to remain so given their practices. As far as what else I could tell you about their faith, I can't tell you a whole lot because it is very esoteric and secretive. They don't allow even their own Druze. Not everybody's an initiate into the faith. There's only a select group of the elite that really actually takes part in many of the religious practices. So they're very secretive about it. All I can tell you is that they do believe in reincarnation. They don't tend grave sites, for example. And that might be one reason why they have had a reputation in the past of being great fighters, not fearing death, perhaps. This is a more secular Druze. She's not wearing any white veil, for example. The religious Druze, the women will wear a white veil. The men would wear a typical Druze mustache that's required, and they shave their heads and wear like a white cap. So you have these more secular Druze who are not fully initiated into the faith yet, dressing more Western. And this is a more devout Druze. She actually fixed our meal for us we were in the Golan when we visited. And this Druze gentleman, he doesn't sport the Druze mustache, but again, he's not an initiate into the faith. But he is a Druze, and he identifies as such. And he's in this Druze village called Malshem in the Golan. And living in the Golan, they are not loyal to the state of Israel because they live on the occupied territories of what had been Syria. So their loyalties are with Syria. Druze who are citizens of Israel, loyal to Israel, these are technically citizens of Syria living in the occupied lands of the Golan. And the idea is that one day they will return to Syrian control. Until that happens, they are just living in what is known as occupied territory. And although they have been given Golan residency, which entitles them to travel within the state of Israel, because many Israelis want to see the Golan remain part of Israel, that's a privilege that many other people in the occupied territories don't have. Nevertheless, they're kind of cut off from the Syrians, by which they don't have, Israel does not have diplomatic relations. And so he was showing us that how, this is the Syrian border, how traditionally many of their Syrian relatives would come to that side of the valley, and they would use bullhorns to talk to each other across the valley. On occasion, they might be able to arrange a visa where one could marry someone from their family, extended family that is, on the other side of the border. And in this village, actually, there have been recent conflicts. There is a military outpost, an Israeli military outpost in the center of town that remains mined. And they've had children that have actually stepped on the mines, and that hasn't been good. There's actually was a riot earlier this year in the town when Israeli police came to the home of one of the villagers and arrested the son and wanted to question the rest of the family. The whole village kind of turned out and trapped the police inside in the home until reinforcements could arrive. No one was killed, fortunately, but it was a violent standoff. So these are not typical Druze as what we would see as citizens of Israel, but these are Druze who are technically Syrian citizens of Syria. Most Druze actually live in Lebanon. So again, the Golan Heights, this is the village that I visited, would have been right up here. All right, so that gives you some maybe lesser known minorities within the state of Israel, but of course you know about the Palestinians, also Arab Israelis, most of them Muslim, but some of them Christian as well. And those who stayed behind after 1948, they got citizenship of Israel. They're full citizens of Israel. They have rights under the law. They can vote. They can run for parliament. And this is a Arab political party in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. And although they're never going to dominate the Israeli Knesset, in fact, the other Israeli political parties really don't want to have much to do with them. So they're really marginal as far as what kind of legislation that they can actually pass. But they do participate politically. So, you know you can be a citizen but still face discrimination. Some of these Arab Israelis would be Christian. This is a Christian cross of Jerusalem. And this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, important to Christians in Jerusalem for being the site where Jesus was believed to have been crucified and buried. And you have various Christian faiths that run the church. I believe this is a Coptic priest, but you also have Orthodox, you have Catholics, you have Coptics, you have Armenians. And they all kind of contest with each other over the control of their segment of the church. So much so that the gates or the doors of the church are locked, and the keys to that lock are held by a Muslim family that has held them for centuries, going back to Saladin, who defeated the Crusaders. And Christians will frequently want to experience the walk along the crucifixion. This is kind of a medieval version of it. It's called the Via Dolorosa, but you see many Christians along the way carrying cross, reciting the Stations of the Cross along the way. This is an Arab Israeli who happens to be Christian in her shop. And of course, most Arab Israelis would be Muslim. And this is the Dome of the Rock Shrine, very important to Muslims in Jerusalem. It's actually believed to be built on the very spot that the ancient Jewish temple was, that the Romans destroyed. So it's unfortunate that this Dome of the Rock Shrine is here, but this is where Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven before he died. And there is a rock in there that, on which that happened. There's also that rock is believed to be where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac, according to the Jews. It's where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Ishmael, according to the Arabs. So they both revere Abraham as a founder of both of their faiths. And to rebuild this temple would require removing this important shrine, the third most holiest site in all of Islam. And you can see the beauty. This actually dates back to the 7th century, which is the century in which Muhammad lived. So it's one of the oldest buildings within Islam. And here you see some Muslims on the Temple Mount praying. Jews will not pray up here. Muslims pray on the Temple Mount. Jews will pray at the Wailing Wall, which is the wall that I showed you down below. It's a very sensitive area. In fact, it was Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, his visit here back in the year 2000, which started the Second Intifada. It was considered a very provocative act by the Arabs, the Palestinians. So you have Arab Israelis that are citizens of Israel, and yet they face discrimination. How? These are some of their grievances. Only Jews qualify for automatic citizenship of Israel. You have Arab Israelis, it's hard for them to even, if they marry someone who's an Arab from another country, it's hard to get them citizenship of Israel. But if you're born anywhere in the world as a Jew, you're automatically given Israeli citizenship. From the Arab-Israeli point of view, unfair. Jewish communities in Israel have been known to receive more government funding So they face discrimination that way. So many Arab Israelis are discriminated against in employment. Arabs are not allowed to live in many of their pre-1948 villages. Many of the villages that these Arabs lived in after the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, the villages were destroyed, or what was left of them was, and many, as if to erase the memory of the Arab presence there. And many of these Arab Israelis are not allowed to go back to the site of their former villages. There are also no non-Jewish state symbols like in the flag or the national anthem that really leaves many Arab Israelis alienated in their own state, in their own society. This is the Israeli flag, for example. It has a Jewish Star of David, has become very much associated with the Jewish faith, although historically it was not as much. Prior to the 19th century, it would have been the menorah that would have been the greatest symbol of Judaism, but this has become important, probably because of the Holocaust. And of course, the colors here are the colors of a Jewish prayer shawl. So this is very symbolic of Judaism, and yet not all Israelis are Jews. And for them, it would be, if you bring it to the United States, imagine living in the United States and having this as your flag. Right? There are some Americans who might like to have this as our flag and see the United States as being founded by God himself in many ways, and important to the founding of our country. But I think there's equally, or if not more, Americans who would find this disturbing. And certainly if this was our flag, you would find many non-Christians, many Jews, Jewish Americans, many Muslim Americans, who would have a very difficult time pledging allegiance to this flag. And yet that is, the previous flag, this flag is what many non-Jews are expected to be allegiant to. And it's problematic. Well, I've spent a lot of time talking about the ethnic divisions within the State of Israel proper, but we know that the greater division is between those who don't have citizenship in the West Bank and the State of Israel. This is where most of the violence and the conflict has been. Most of the Arab Israelis, despite all their grievances, they haven't strapped on vests with dynamite and gone into shops and blown themselves up for the most part. That's just, by and large, hasn't happened. You've seen that mostly from Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, yet living under Israeli control in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or the Golan Heights traditionally. So this chart shows you some demographic information, which I think is important. If you look at the State of Israel, there's 5.4 million Jews in the State of Israel, and a population of almost 6 million people. If we just count what the United States recognizes as the borders. In the rest of the world, there's 7.5 million Jews, and the vast majority of them in the United States. So the United States is the second most important Jewish country on the planet. Almost as many Jews in the United States as are in the State of Israel. If you look at the Palestinians and the people who identify as such, people who speak Arabic, who lived in what the British called Palestine, 1.4 million of them are citizens of the State of Israel, the Arab Israelis that I've been referring to. In the West Bank, there are 2.4 million Palestinians. In the Gaza Strip, 1.4 million. In the rest of the world, 4 million, many of them in Jordan and then other Arab countries. But if you look at just these three and add them together, you basically get almost 5 million. You get basically half the population of this region that is not Jewish, that are in fact identified as being Palestinian. If you look at just within the border of Israel and those who have Israeli citizenship, 80% of the population is Jewish. But if you count all the population in the lands that they occupy, only 50% of the population is Jewish. You can see that how precarious the situation is from an Israeli Jew standpoint. Despite their importance to them to have Israel be a Jewish state, the future doesn't look very bright along those lines. It's a precarious situation at best. especially when you have 1 in 5 of your own citizens not really identifying as Jewish and therefore having their loyalty suspect. This is the ancient city of Jerusalem. I assure you the modern city has overblown these ancient walls, but it shows you the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock Shrine. This is the Wailing Wall where Jews would pray. This is the retaining wall to this Temple Mount. This is the Muslim quarter of the ancient city, the Christian quarter, the Jewish quarter, and the Armenian quarter. The 1948 boundary between the West Bank and the State of Israel came right down here. This portion, the ancient city itself, would have all been controlled by the Arabs. The Jews only controlled West Jerusalem. But of course, after the 1967 war, Jews got the whole thing. Even though the United States does not recognize East Jerusalem, which is where this is, as a part of the State of Israel. One of the first things the Jews did after 1967 is they came in and they destroyed a bunch of Palestinian homes here, clearing out the plaza in front of the Wailing Wall, giving signs from the very onset that they had no intention of ever giving it back. The Jews that had fled this area after 1948 were invited to come back. But what's interesting is that Arabs living in this area who fled West Jerusalem are not allowed to go back to this day. But the Jews who fled in 1948 after 1967's recapture were allowed back into this quarter. And unfortunately, from the State of Israel's point of view, most secular Jews have chosen not to live here. What they wanted to have in a very eclectic mix of different Jews has pretty much become ultra-Orthodox. Then you've got the rest of the West Bank as a problem, where Jews are basically migrating, setting up settlements. And these red dots basically show you Jewish settlements in the West Bank. What the Palestinians hope will be a Palestinian state of their own. It makes that possibility all the more problematic the more Israeli Jews that set up settlements here. And like I said, the building of Israeli settlements in this occupied territory from the UN point of view is a violation of the Security Council resolution. And it's a violation of international law, even unto the United States. And yet it keeps happening, and American presidents have been unable to get the Israelis to stop doing it. This is a typical settlement, usually built on a very high defensive ground. This is Har Homa. This gentleman is an Israeli, and he's showing us areas of East Jerusalem where Palestinian homes have been bulldozed. Basically, to get a building permit in Jerusalem is very difficult. And so you've had a lot of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, their families growing, and they're getting very crowded in these dwellings where they can't really get out. And many of them have built homes outside their parents' homes anyway. And anything built after 1967 without a building permit is an illegal construction. And so the Israeli government feels free at any time to come in and just bulldoze the home. And usually they will only give like a half-hour warning. Now, in some cases, the Palestinians have been notified and the Palestinians have torn their own homes down rather than have them bulldozed, because in that way they can actually still use the wood. They can salvage whatever they can. And there are even Israeli groups that are actually horrified by this practice. And like I said, the man I just showed you is an Israeli Jew who's very sympathetic with the plight of the Palestinians. And he's actually tried to help them launch legal challenges in Israeli courts, sometimes successfully. And although you have settlers who also building on illegal land, sometimes their homes will be destroyed as well, but they always rebuild. And the Palestinians generally cannot. Here are some Palestinians in Hebron, and here you have an Israeli soldier dealing with Palestinians in the neighborhood. Hebron is actually a very important city religiously, because it has the tomb of the patriarchs where Abraham is considered to be buried. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac. And so it's important to both Arabs and Jews. Here you have, in Hebron, Palestinians are required to walk on the side of the road behind these barricades. The street is reserved for Israeli citizens. And here you have some Israeli settlers going for their jog, carrying their assault rifle. These are the people who are most, that Palestinians are most afraid of. I showed you the Israeli soldier before. But Palestinians are at least, they have some sense of security with the Israeli soldiers because they can at least predict how an Israeli soldier is going to behave. These guys walking around with no uniforms, carrying assault rifles, Palestinians have no idea how they're going to behave. And my Palestinian guide said on more than one occasion he's had an Israeli settler just point an assault rifle at him. And he never knows if he's going to pull the trigger or not. He quickly tries to look around. It's a little comforting if there's an Israeli soldier nearby who can kind of be an eyewitness to but what if no soldier is around? The Palestinians aren't allowed to carry guns that freely. This is an Israeli settlement in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem. And my Israeli guide was telling me how provocative this is. Instead of being in the Jewish quarter, they've actually acquired a home, usually by subterfuge. Basically, what's typical is they will have, Palestinians have learned not to sell to Jews. And any Palestinian who would willingly sell to a Jew would be treated horribly by his own people. Because they've learned not to sell to Jews. But sometimes Jews will use third parties, covertly acquire the property, and then move in. And what they've done here is they've not only moved in, but they're flying the Israeli flag all over the Muslim quarter of what is technically occupied territory. A very provocative act, according to my Israeli guide who showed me that. Here you have an example of various license plates. This is a Palestinian license plate, non-citizen of Israel. Here's an Israeli license plate. Now, they're both using this road, but there are many roads that Palestinians cannot drive on that are reserved for Israelis only. And certain roads the Israelis would not want to drive on, considering that they're controlled by the Palestinian Authority. This is a shopping district in Hebron. Hebron is fallen on economic hard times from the Palestinian point of view because it has been the flashpoint for a lot of violence. Like I said, the importance of that city because of its religious significance. The tourists just aren't coming to Hebron anymore like they used to. And when they do, they're not visiting the Arab center of town. So you see a lot of the bazaar here closed down. This is an area of Hebron that's quite unique, where you don't have many Israeli settlements literally right on top of Palestinians. But this is one area in which you do. Again, it points to the importance of the city of Hebron, religiously speaking, where you actually have Israeli settlers who've moved up into the second story of these homes. So the Palestinians are living on the main floor of this street, and Israeli settlers living up above. So what the Palestinians have had to do is they've had to erect this fencing to keep the stuff that keeps flying out of the upper windows off of them, because the Israeli settlers above continually show their contempt for the Palestinians below by throwing all their trash and any disgusting thing they want down on the people below. So the Palestinians have erected this. You can see some of the trash here, and that's a close-up view of it. At either end of that street is a Israeli military guard tower protecting the Israeli settlers above the dwelling. This is the infamous security wall or barrier that the Israelis have built since the Second Intifada. And this is an Israeli guard tower on that wall. Not all of the wall is actually concrete, and nor is it all likely to be. It is not complete, and maybe it won't be. But the Israelis consider it important to keep the suicide bombings to a minimum. And they have been reduced. This is the little town of Bethlehem being strangled by a wall, a security wall. Bethlehem is an Arab town, a Palestinian town. It is in occupied territory. It is not in technically Israeli, the state of Israel. And it is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And so the Israeli government has erected a wall all the way around it. which really kind of points in this picture to the dual use of the wall. On the one hand, it's not only is it a security barrier to protect Israelis, but it is also, from the Palestinian point of view, a way to claim even more land. Because you notice they've separated the Palestinians from their olive fields here. They could have built the wall out here, but they built the wall all the way up next to the Palestinian homes. And again, the Palestinians see this as just another way for the Israeli government to seize more and more land from the Palestinians. Because land that is not farmed or used over a given period of years defaults to the state of Israel, which can then be sold to Israeli settlers. This is another security wall. This is technically within the bounds of Jerusalem. And this is actually protecting 2 Israeli homes from a Palestinian suburb out here. But again, it's also seizing more and more land. This is graffiti within Bethlehem, and I think it kind of sums up the Palestinian perspective. That is, to exist is to resist. That their continued existence is their resistance to the state of Israel. As long as they're here, the Israelis have not won completely. And so just their surviving is their resistance. More graffiti in Bethlehem. The dove of peace wearing a flak jacket. And you can see the bullet holes throughout the wall. This is a Palestinian refugee camp outside of Bethlehem, Ida refugee camp. And this is in the form of a keyhole, and this is obviously a key, which has become very symbolic to the Palestinians, because many of the Palestinians who fled what became known as the State of Israel have retained the keys to those homes as a symbol of their desire to one day go back to their homes. Homes that, if the State of Israel has anything to do with it, they'll never see again. And I talked to a Palestinian who actually got into East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, what had been the State of Israel prior to the 1967 war. And they said they put their key in the lock, it still worked. And the woman who answered said, "What are you doing?" He said, "This is my home." She says, "No, no, no. We bought this home from so-and-so." It's interesting that the Palestinians have borrowed the symbolism from the Jews themselves. I mean, because the Jews who fled Spain at the hands of the Christians for centuries kept their keys to their homes in Spain, the Sephardic Jews. And so the Palestinians adopting the same sort of symbolism for the same political effect. This is the United Nations Relief Works Agency, is what's responsible for Palestinian refugee camps around the world. This one is Aida with the West Bank, but there are many refugee camps in Jordan and other parts of the world. And I should point out, the United States is a major funder of the United Nations program that tends to the needs and the education of Palestinians who are educated through this UN program. And this is a refugee camp in Jordan, Palestinian refugee camp with Palestinian children going to school, funded by that UN program. You know, for all of the talk of a Palestinian state, Golda Meir, a former prime minister of Israel, once said that the Palestinians don't need a state. There's already a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan. What she meant by that is that about half the population of Jordan are Palestinian refugees. So, and that's an interesting dance between the indigenous population of Jordan and the Palestinians. This keffiyeh being worn by this man denotes the fact that he is Palestinian. Many of the indigenous Jordanians would wear the red keffiyeh. And they don't necessarily get along with their Palestinian neighbors in Jordan. Jordan and the king of Jordan accepted all these Palestinian refugees, and they treated them better than in many other Arab states by at least extending citizenship to these Palestinian refugees. But there's still an ongoing tension between the Palestinians, who see themselves as somewhat distinct, and the indigenous Jordanians. The Palestinians be much more urban, sophisticated, more educated. Many of the Jordanians, from the Palestinian point of view, being kind of hillbillish, descendants from Bedouin, and and more likely to work for the government than have their own business. This is a Bedouin tent. There are also Bedouin in Israel, as a matter of fact, even though the Israeli government is trying to get these nomads to settle down in one location rather than living the nomadic life of actually roaming around the desert with their flocks. This is the Palestinian flag. I know you can't see it very well, and a picture of Yasser Arafat, who's now dead, and Mahmoud Abbas, the current leader of the Palestinian Authority. This flag, made up of red, green, white, black, was banned when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was considered a terrorist organization through much of the 20th century. The Israeli government would not allow it. And so what many Palestinians would do is they would slice open a watermelon, the watermelon having all the same colors. And there wasn't much that the Israeli government could do about Palestinians putting watermelons in their windows. But it was their way to show the Palestinian colors without actually having the Palestinian flag, a subtle form of resistance. This is the Palestinian police force. So in certain areas of the occupied territories of the West Bank, like Bethlehem, like Nablus, Ramallah, in these cities, the Palestinians do have some local self-government with their own police force due to the peace talks that occurred in the 1990s, all with the idea of there eventually being a Palestinian state. That part of the agreement has not been realized. But in certain of these cities, the Palestinians do have their own government, local government, with their own police force, but it is very limited. And we should make a point of noting that there are two major political parties that are in the news frequently. One is Hamas, one is Fatah. Fatah is the secular Palestinian party of Yasser Arafat. It is what currently controls the West Bank that the Palestinians actually have some autonomy over. The Gaza Strip is controlled by Hamas. Hamas is a religious political party, a Muslim fundamentalist party that believes in imposing Sharia law. And so even within the Palestinian camp, what's going to make peace problematic is that you've got, in essence, you've had a civil war between the secular Palestinians under Fatah and Hamas, the fundamentalist Palestinians who want Sharia law. And so that division between those two parts of the occupied territories has been problematic. This is my wife, and a Catholic Palestinian, and some of in this shop have denoted the fact this is in Bethlehem. They wanted to show that they were Christian Palestinians, and they've tattooed their arms to reveal that. I found that kind of disturbing myself, but they've let it be known that they're organizing to make sure that Hamas doesn't take over Bethlehem, even though most of Bethlehem now is Muslim, because many of the Christians have left for better economic opportunities in the United States and Europe. Well, I can see I'm short on time. I do want to devote some time to Q&A, so I guess I'll stop there. Is there any questions that you have over what I've talked about in the various ethnic groups, both within the state of Israel proper and in the occupied territories?
Can I have a word just to say something real quick? It's not a question. Sure. If anyone, hopefully everyone, cares about the Palestinian cause, there's this website, there's an opportunity which will expire by the end of this month for you to donate anything, $5, $10 to this website, PalestineChronicles.com. This website is basically dedicated to, telling the Palestinian side of the story. So if, whatever you can, they're trying to accumulate some money for, maintaining the website. So it's PalestineChronicles.com, and thank you.
There's one back there.
I do have a loud voice. Use the microphone. Are you familiar with the book The Chosen?
I haven't read it, no.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess that deals with my question.
So where's the conflict at now? What's going on now with the West Bank and Palestine and?
Well, like I said, the Gaza Strip is controlled by Hamas. The West Bank is controlled by Fatah. Those two parties do not see eye to eye. They've basically fought a civil war against each other. and they've basically consolidated their control of their respective territory. So you don't really see either at the moment of being a model of democracy, and yet the United States is working with Fatah. We prefer them. Hamas is still considered by the United States to be a terrorist organization, so we haven't really been talking to them, at least officially. Although I believe that eventually we'll have to. After all, in the last election that the Palestinians had that was free and fair in 2006, Hamas was the party that won. Democratically. And it wasn't necessarily because Palestinians voted for them, not necessarily because they wanted to see Sharia law, but Fatah had gained a reputation for corruption and squandering a lot of the Palestinians' taxes. And so that was part of what gave Hamas that victory. And of course, the United States worked to undermine that victory as soon as it happened. I mean, we're all about democracy except when our side doesn't win, apparently. And no sooner did Hamas win that election than the United States pulled out all support for the Palestinian Authority that was governed by Hamas. And we basically encouraged Fatah to use a military coup to seize back power, which they have in fact done. It doesn't bode well for the future of democracy. And as long as they're divided, it doesn't bode well for an agreement with Israel over the founding of a Palestinian state, which for many people believed would encompass both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Remember that the Golan Heights are not Palestinian. That is part of Syria, and Syria wants that back.
I got a question. Why is Israel allowed to get away with the things that they're currently still doing when they agreed to the resolution?
Well, Israel did not agree to the UN Security Council resolution that I referred to back in 1967. That was passed despite what the State of Israel wanted. But you're right, it is, because it's a Security Council resolution, it does have the effect of international law, and the United States is pledged to uphold it. And yet, you're right, the State of Israel continues to violate the resolution by building settlements in the occupied territories. And you're right, why is the State of Israel basically given a pass for violating a UN Security Council resolution when Saddam Hussein violated a UN Security Council resolution and that justified invading the country? There is definitely a double standard, mainly with the United States, between what Israel does and what other countries are allowed to do.
My point is, even if they didn't agree to the resolution, why is Israel still building on territory that is not theirs?
Because no one has been willing to stop them. The Palestinians would if they could, but they can't. So, might makes right in this situation. The Israeli has the might to do what they want, so they do it.
But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily right. It only
right.
perpetuates
That's
the war,
right.
makes it, and that's why it's so divided now, because they're getting away with so much that they're doing. Either they should try to agree to the resolution, the security resolution, or stop building. To me, it's simple. If they didn't agree to the U.S. resolution, you could at least respect the boundaries.
I would be in agreement with that. I mean, I think that Israel should stop building, but Israel's not going to do it on its own. It would require the United States, and the United States lacks the political will to really crack down. I mean, you saw Barack Obama come into office, and he actually seemed serious about getting the Israelis to stop. But even they didn't listen to him. And he got the political backlash from Americans in the United States that made Barack Obama back off doing anything about it. So even Barack Obama has been forced to look the other way on these things. So I agree with you. It's not just. I also agree with you that the solution is not complicated. There is a solution. A lot of people talk about these people fighting in forever and there being no solution. I think that's nonsense. For one thing, I think I've shown you that there are Arab Israelis, citizens of Israel, who live along fine with their Jewish neighbors. They have their grievances, but they're not killing each other. Most of them are Muslim, some of them Christian, many all identifying as Palestinian, and they are citizens of Israel. The problem is the fact that you've got this large Palestinian population that are citizens of no place. right? And they don't have a state of their own. And, and because they're not citizens of any place, they don't have the same rights under the law. I mean, one thing would be to make them all citizens of Israel. You know, some Palestinians would, I think 25% of Palestinians said they would accept that as a solution. But I assure you the state of Israel has no intention of making them all citizens of Israel because, as I said, it would jeopardize their whole concept of Israel being a Jewish state because then 50% of the Israeli population would be non-Jewish. They'd change the name of the country to Palestine in a minute. It's not something that the state of Israel, that's called the one-state solution, by the way. That's why Israel, as a government, is more on record with a two-state solution, a separate state of Palestine. But yet they're even haven't really taken serious steps towards that. So.
You may have already elaborated a little bit on what my question was. Well, in your opinion, in regards to how the United States handles its foreign affairs in Israel and overseeing or overlooking some of the things that have been happening, would you elaborate a little bit deeper as far as why do you think the rationale is for that under the circumstances?
The rationale for the United States
to overlook a lot of the, well, for instance, a lot of the territorial disputes and this type of thing, and not putting down a more definitive.
I think the rationale is due to domestic American politics. Many Americans identify and support Israel,
right.
The state of Israel. That's right, and which is kind of baffling to me. You know, most Americans are Christian. You know, traditionally, 1 in 10 Palestinians are Christian. You would think there would be some more affinity for the Palestinians because many of them are Christian and they've had their homes taken from them as well. But there isn't. For whatever reason, Americans seem to identify with the state of Israel. Well, it's not just the fact that there's a lot of Jews in the United States. I mean, a lot of Christian Americans actually identify with the state of Israel. And it is baffling to me. I can't fully explain it.
I was just kind of wondering, and maybe get your thoughts on Egypt as a third party, considering now that Jose Mubarak is out, and in particular Hamas and the Gaza Strip, how foreign policy might be handled, considering that most of our foreign aid goes to Israel and Egypt, and what you think may come of all of that.
Well, I'm optimistic, and I'm optimistic primarily because I want to be. I mean, I don't know for a fact that the revolution in Egypt is going to turn out all for the best, but I'm glad that it occurred. I thought Mubarak was a dictator. I'm glad that he was overthrown. I know his people hated him. I've been there. I didn't talk to one Egyptian who liked Mubarak. Even the Christians in Egypt didn't like him. So I think, but I never thought that it would happen until Mubarak. I thought Mubarak would die before there would be a rebellion. It happened before his death, which surprised me. And then the way it happened also surprised me. I thought it would be violent. For the most part, it wasn't. It was a very non-violent direct action, civil disobedient tactics used like Martin Luther King would have used, like Gandhi used, protesters organizing, picketing, you know, sit down in Tahrir Square. I mean, it's amazing how little violence there was in that unrest. So you had basically a non-violent revolution in the most important Arab country. You know, so much for the American stereotype that all Arabs are bloodthirsty and violent. I mean, this revolution is remarkable. I think it's a watershed. It's definitely shaken up the game. Egypt was very much, you know, Mubarak's regime had made peace with Israel. This has really shaken things up as far as the Israelis are concerned, which might be for the better, because there was certainly stalemate at the peace table between the Palestinians and the Israelis before. Now that the game table has been shaken up a little bit, maybe the Israelis' insecurity might lead them to see the benefit of making a separate peace with the Palestinians. I'm hopeful in that regard, but we can't be sure. Any other questions? Well,
why don't we give Professor St. Clair a round of applause?
Thank you all for coming.